good if we win.
Deep right field. Another absolute bomb over the flag
all the
court.
time.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff. If you are following along with us live on YouTube and Facebook, you will see that we are not in the podcast studio because our cameras in there decided not to work. So we're in the web studio here. Look, maybe we're just doing anything to switch up the vibes at this point. Notably, you will see that Annie's creepy bobblehead is not in here with us. Maybe that'll change up the mojo a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, some technical difficulties week in, week out. Maybe it's also a sign of shifting the mojo, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Decided to give my podcast or my bobblehead a little bit of a break. Maybe she is worn out, and maybe she is a representation
from
of
seeing the
offense.
bobblehead and being scared every time I enter the office.
Yeah, well, we're testing out the theory that the bobblehead is bad luck. I, for one, don't believe that that is the case, but we will see after
There's
today's
no way
game.
to prove that it's not the reason
Well, we'll find
the
out
Orioles
today
are off
after
to this
this
start.
After this game.
That's true, because we are going to diagnose why the Orioles are off to a 6-10 start to begin the year. Before we get to that, Annie, we have to go through the long list of injuries that Mike Elias gave us an update on yesterday. It was about a 25-minute scrum with reporters at Camden Yards here yesterday, and he spent the first 6 full minutes of that. I timed it, 6 minutes just talking about injuries. That's how many guys are currently unavailable for Baltimore. So we're going to start with that. We're going to take these injuries one by one, and then we're going to talk about why the Orioles are off to the start that they are off to, just 6-10, and have really struggled so far to start the season. But let's get into the injuries here. We'll take these one by one. The first one, Zach Eflin, according to Elias, quote, continues to feel really good after his lat strain, going to start playing catch in a few days and see how that goes. And so far, everything is encouraging. The last thing that Elias said that was not as encouraging was that he is hopeful that this injury stint is measured in weeks and not months. That's not discouraging,
right?
Because everything Elias said about Zach Eflin was a good update, that he is feeling good, that he is progressing, that he is moving along, all that good stuff. But if you're hopeful that it's weeks and not months, I think the initial reaction we had to this injury was hoping that it would be a close to minimum stay on the 15-day injured list, and I suppose 2 weeks is technically still a multiple of weeks. But if you're saying that you're hopeful that it's not months, that leads me to believe that the weeks might be more like 4 or 5.
Yeah.
We don't know, right? But that is just, maybe it's a semantics thing and I'm reading too much into it. But if you're hopeful that it's weeks and not months, that feels like a lot of weeks.
Yeah, and it's hard not to read into these types of things as well because, Mike Elias always does his best to say, okay, I'm not going to pinpoint a timetable for this, and we're going to talk about that for the other injuries as well. But it's really difficult not to read into, okay, more than weeks. Well, we thought originally like maybe it was just going to be 7 days, or maybe it would be 1 to 2 weeks maximum, and then you hear that quote saying, hopefully not months and maybe just a few weeks. That also is not the worst news because, yes, he is hopeful that it isn't going to be months, but at the same time, there's also always going to be that possibility. And for someone of the caliber and the need for Zach Eflin, especially right now with the starting rotation, you're really, really hoping that it is on the lower side of the amount of weeks, maybe 2 max, hopefully.
2 would be nice. He is on the 15-day injured list. That is the minimum injured list stay for a pitcher. It's really an emphasis on the hopeful because Zach Eflin was really the only member of this starting rotation that had been putting up reliably good numbers throughout the start of the year. And that is a rotation that is also without Grayson Rodriguez, who Mike Elias said was recovering from, he called it a tricep elbow injury. So even Mike Elias was being kind of vague about what that injury was. He has thrown 2 bullpens. The most recent one had off-speed pitches, which is good. Again, that's all a good sign. He's got another bullpen tomorrow. Elias said, quote, a lot ahead of us in terms of bullpens, build-up, live BP, rehab assignments, and there is no timetable for Grayson's return quite yet. Again, it is good news in terms of he is progressing well, he is feeling good, he is looking good, but if you are starting to crunch the numbers a little bit and the sense of urgency for this Orioles team has progressed a little bit more, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the slow start to the season, but it would be one thing if the Orioles were cruising and Grayson Rodriguez was months away, but just looking at the things he needs to get through, it's bullpens, and then probably a few weeks later you're starting to build up, and then a few weeks later you're doing live BP, and then a few weeks later you're doing rehab assignments, and then a few weeks later you're back in the big leagues. And I'm not a math whiz, but I just said a few weeks later a bunch of times.
Yeah.
And so that's probably going to be a lot of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, you could even tell in Elias's tone when he said there's still a lot ahead of us. He knew that there was going to be some weight into that, and that was another little section of where it starts out encouraging, like where you have Grayson, who's thrown 2 bullpens right now and continuing to progress, but at the same time, there's no timetable, which is really kind of the nail on the head at the end of it to end each injury update, where you have these 2 guys, Grayson Rodriguez, Zach Eflin, who in the offseason we were even toying around. Maybe they have a fight for being the ace, and Grayson Rodriguez surely has ace potential, but he had an injury last season and still was making his way to come into it and have a breakout season. And then you are struck with these 2 injuries, and neither of them are really clear as day as to what they could bring. And it also hurts when you don't have depth to be able to fill that in because of injuries. So it just hurts.
Yeah, the depth is not there either. So we'll talk about the depth guys that Elias gave us an update on. Albert Suarez's injury shouldn't be a long-term thing in terms of years, Elias said. It's not something that is going to require a major surgery and is going to put him out for a lot of next year, but he's just resting right now. He's still a while away from catch or anything like that. And Elias has said that, as they have talked about, is not a surprise that if Suarez is coming back this season, it is not going to be until much later in the year. And then 2 more depth guys that we got updates on as well, Chase McDermott and Trevor Rogers. He lumped into the same group just because they're on similar timetables. They have both thrown multiple bullpens, and their velocity is built up. That's a good sign. They are facing live hitters in Sarasota next week, and then potentially could be activated before the end of May. So that's really good.
Yeah.
That's an encouraging sign for both of those guys, but that is still at least a month away from getting Chase McDermott or Trevor Rogers back as potentially depth pieces in this starting rotation. And Albert Suarez, we are not going to see until the very end of the season.
Right, and you could even argue that Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers, these 2 injuries hurt a lot more than what it seems like at face value, because yes, you got in Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton in the offseason to provide depth, but at the same time, you also had Cade Povich, Albert Suarez, Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers as those 4 next guys that could be starting rotation depth. Luckily, you have Cade Povich right now, but Albert Suarez, Chase McDermott, Trevor Rogers, these are all guys that were supposed to provide extra depth for Sugano and Morton should anything happen, starts and injuries. Otherwise, that these 2 guys were going to be the next to call up, and then obviously you don't even have that. And it's not like you can fault the front office or anything for the lack of depth right now, because what they did and had going into spring training was a whole lot of pitching depth and starting rotation depth. And now just with all of these injuries, it's really just a really tough blow.
Yeah, they couldn't have brought in more options for the starting rotation. I mean, you can make whatever arguments you want to for, the type of player that they brought in. However, they brought in a ton of depth for the starting rotation because they didn't want to be in the same spot that they were in last year. And now all of a sudden we're talking about 7 starting pitchers that are unavailable when you talk about Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells being in that conversation as well. So we'll touch on those 2 guys briefly too. Kyle Bradish threw a bullpen the other day. Mike Elias said he is, quote, flying along, which is good. Still wouldn't think of him as any sooner than the later half of the summer, but that is at least an encouraging sign, because if you were thinking of Kyle Bradish as an August or September call-up, I mean, he still could be August, but if you were thinking of him as a September call-up, then Kyle Bradish probably isn't going to be a starting pitcher at the end of the season. But if we're talking later half of the summer and all of a sudden it gets into late July, early August, and we're talking about Kyle Bradish as a possibility, now we're talking about him being a starting pitcher down the stretch, which could be a much different impact for the Orioles if he is actually starting games rather than just coming out of the bullpen. Tyler Wells apparently a little bit behind Kyle Bradish. He has not had any mound progression yet. Hopefully that is coming in the next few weeks, Elias said, and also noting that they expect him back, quote, well before the end of the season. So that is at least encouraging news on those two guys. You got to get there. The conversation around Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells has been that, down the stretch when this team is competing for a playoff spot in August and September, it's going to be a huge boost to get these guys back. You got to be in a position for these guys to really help you down the stretch. So you've got to tread water for as long as you can until Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells come back. And now, unfortunately, you're in a position where you were talking about treading water until Zach Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez and Chase McDermott and Trevor Rogers come back. It's a lot of treading water.
Right, and it was kind of the motto last season, too, when you saw Kyle Bradish go down with TJ and everyone else as well that was in the same boat as Kyle Bradish, was that you had to tread water, and they did a pretty decent job. They made it to a second consecutive postseason run in the playoffs with having to have tread water. But right now, when it's so early in the season, you're relying on guys like Charlie Morton and Tomoyuki Sugano, who are experiencing their first season in this clubhouse. It is a lot more of a different story where you got to get these guys like Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez back. And especially with Kyle Bradish, too, because Elias also noted that he's the type of guy that they're not going to rush that kind of recovery. And we heard that from him last season when it was Grayson Rodriguez as well, when they were trying to bring him back for that postseason and playoff push right before it. Was this kind of caliber of a pitcher, you're not going to want to rush him because you don't want to make it worse further down the stretch. And unfortunately, and fortunately, in the same sense, is Kyle Bradish is going to be that exact same guy, maybe even more so because of the impact that he had on the clubhouse when he was healthy. So you can't exactly rush this recovery, especially a Tommy John recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to look out for the long-term health of Kyle Bradish and the long-term health of the team, and you're hoping that when he comes back at the end of the season, he is the same Kyle Bradish that we saw as a top 5 Cy Young finisher a few seasons ago. That is a massive, massive piece to get back. So you're not going to rush him there. You're right. The Orioles, aren't going to push him any harder than they need to because they care about his long-term health and the long-term health of the organization and what Kyle Bradish means for the organization. But you need him back in this rotation. You're not going to rush him, but man, and of course, in an ideal world, you would snap your fingers and you would have Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, and Kyle Bradish back in this rotation.
Whole different rotation.
Because they are the 3 best starters that you have. And they are all out right now. Real quick, before we get into the rotation conversation, at least a positive injury note. Andrew Kittredge, Mike Elias was big on the flying along adjective, but continues to fly along with rehab, throwing bullpens, could get him into live BP in about 2 weeks, and rehab could come a few weeks after, so it's possible that we could see him before the end of May.
Yeah, that's
huge. Which would be huge to get Andrew Kittredge back because, as we have noted, he was one of the best setup men in baseball last year. He takes a lot of pressure off guys like Sir Anthony Dominguez and Yennier Cano, who are, and Gregory Soto as well, who are frequently in that 7th, 8th inning position, but also need to be available to help Felix Bautista, who is probably not going to be pitching back-to-back days for a while. So getting Andrew Kittredge, adding him into that mix would be huge for a bullpen that needs to, quite frankly, pick up some of the slack for the starting rotation right now. That is not performing the way that anybody had hoped so far. So let's get into that conversation. As we have said, there are so many injuries in this rotation that it is hard to truly evaluate them because we have talked about 7 guys that could be in this rotation that are not available in Eflin, Grayson, Suarez, Bradish, Wells, McDermott, and Rogers. That's a lot of options. And the issues of this rotation are amplified. I know the numbers are not good. We're going to get into, Charlie Morton and Dean Kramer and what we've seen from those 2 guys specifically so far, along with Sugano and Povich. Their struggles are amplified by the fact that in an ideal world, you knew that you weren't going to have Kyle Bradish coming into the year. But let's say you had a healthy Zach Eflin and you had a healthy Grayson Rodriguez. Charlie Morton at that point is at best your number 3. He's your number 3, number 4, number 5 guy. You have Morton, Kramer, Povich, Sugano as your options to fill out the final 3 spots in the starting rotation. So if Charlie Morton was just a depth starting rotation piece and he was not your number 2 pitcher to begin the year, his 8.84 ERA, yeah, it's not good, and you don't want to have an 8.84 ERA in the rotation, but you would be able to look at Morton and Kramer and say, man, we really need better out of those 2 guys, but not look at it as much of a dire situation as it kind of feels like it's getting to be at this point, because it's 4 starts from Charlie Morton, it's 3 starts from Dean Kramer. That shouldn't be the end of the world in a season where everybody is healthy. It's still an issue, but they are just your number 2 and number 3 starters in the rotation at this point to begin the year. Charlie Morton is now, if you were bumping him up based on where he was at the beginning of the season, because Zach Eflin goes down, he was 1, Charlie Morton started the second game. Now Charlie Morton's your number 1 starter in the rotation technically, and he's gotten 8.84. That's an issue, but it's amplified because of the fact that you don't have the 7 guys that we've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the pitching depth has just drastically changed, and the rotation has drastically changed from where you were when you acquired Sugano and Morton in the offseason to right now, because what it looked like was that the depth looked really good, and you had conversations of who's even going to fit into the starting rotation, and right now it is just completely different, a whole different ball game, no pun intended, where it's just you are relying on Charlie Morton and Sugano and Kramer to keep you afloat when it really shouldn't be that case to begin with. And next you're also going to rely on Brandon Young potentially to come in and also save the day when these guys are going to be picking up a lot more slack than they would have to start the season if everyone was healthy and the starting rotation looked the way that it was supposed to. Very similar to last season as well, when Albert Suarez was going to be that guy where you maybe had him in the bullpen and you maybe had him in the rotation, but it fell onto him for a large part of the season when you lost Rodriguez and when Bradish was down, Tyler Wells, John Means, you name it, where the whole starting rotation was drastically shifted. With Suarez, he put up a lot of great numbers and consistency that you needed. Charlie Morton was supposed to be that guy, and it's still early. It's obviously a really small sample size to begin, but it is hard to look over that 8+ ERA, and you want to be able to look over it and think that things will get better. I mean, I do still have faith, obviously, because of the very small sample size, but it comes to a point where he's got to kind of figure it out.
Yeah, and the Orioles are 6-10.
Yep.
And it's not like Charlie Morton and Dean Kramer are struggling ERA-wise so far, and the Orioles are 10-6. And you're going, okay, it hasn't been the best starts out of these guys, but we can at least live with what they're giving us right now. They're 6-10. And we can talk about the depth all we want, but Charlie Morton and Dean Kramer were going to be in this rotation either way.
Yeah.
We're probably talking about Cade Povich and Albert Suarez as the 2 guys that might have been on the outside looking in of this starting rotation. And Cade Povich has the lowest ERA of any of the 4 regular starting pitchers right now who are still healthy at a 3.60. That being said, Cade Povich is still giving up a 3.69 batting average against, but he's got the best ERA out of any of those guys. So let's start with Morton because he started yesterday, and look, Charlie Morton will be the first one to tell you that he's not pitching well right now.
Yeah.
He said as much yesterday, and I will first want to start with giving credit to Charlie Morton about how open and honest he has been in every post-game press conference about his struggles. I mean, if you were tuned into O's Extra post-game yesterday, they asked Charlie Morton one question in the post-game presser that was aired on the post-game show. I know they asked him many more, but he was even cut off in the middle of his response 3.5 minutes in to the first question because he is being very open about what is not going well for him right now. It's an 8.84 ERA. He's got 11 walks in 18 1/3 innings. I thought he threw the ball a little bit better yesterday, but Morton said it, and I'll kind of echo what he said. The physical characteristics of the rest of his pitches are fine. And by the rest of his pitches, I mean everything outside of his curveball. So we're talking about the fastball, the cutter, his other offerings. Those pitches throughout his career, when he has had good years, those pitches are fine. They are passable. Even the four-seam fastball this year is playing up a little bit compared to what it has been in the past. The difference maker for Charlie Morton is and always has been his curveball. And when his curveball isn't working, Charlie Morton, the rest of his pitches are fine. That's what he said yesterday. And we're not just talking about a curveball that is pretty good. When Charlie Morton is successful, his curveball is one of the best in baseball. He's had multiple seasons over the past 5 years where, based on run value, which is StatCast's way of basically just measuring how valuable a pitch is, his curveball has quite literally been the best in the game multiple times over the past 5 seasons. And right now, his curveball is bad. It's not just bad for Charlie Morton. It's a bad curveball right now. So the curveball needs to come back. And there could be a start in, a week or 3 weeks where he just finds the curveball and then everything else clicks because he doesn't need the other pitches to be outstanding. That's never how he has pitched. But the curveball needs to be really, really good. And so he just needs to figure that out. And he needs to figure it out quickly because it's 4 starts right now that have not been good. He knows he needs to figure it out quickly. But you can sense his frustration because he knows it's one pitch that separates him from being the pitcher he is right now to, not an elite pitcher, but an ERA in the high 3s.
Right.
And pitching into the 6th inning consistently. He just needs to throw the curveball, and then he will get back to that pitcher. You have to imagine.
Right, and you can imagine also that what's making him so frustrated and making this whole situation so frustrating is that when he is at his best, and what he has done since 2008 is when his curveball is at its best. And he is just a very, very different pitcher right now because the curveball, like you mentioned, is not his best. I mean, it is arguably or is his worst.
Yeah, it's the worst he's ever thrown the curveball.
The changeup right now, which he doesn't throw very often, is the only positive run value pitch right now. And it's also the kind of conversation that you wonder if he's wondering and if the pitching coaches are wondering, do you decrease the pitch count of the curveball, or do you really work through this to try and figure out what is wrong with the curveball and how can I make it go back to what it was in previous years and previous seasons, which made him a 10 times better pitcher?
Yeah, it's not a difficult problem to diagnose. If Charlie Morton starts throwing a good curveball, he's going to be fine. But he needs to figure out how to start throwing a good curveball. And it's not a velocity thing. It's not the
stuff is good.
It's not a break. It's like the physical characteristics of his other pitches are fine. His curveball is just getting absolutely hammered. And so if Charlie Morton figures out that curveball again, or rediscovers it is a better way to put it. He doesn't need to figure out how to throw a curveball. He needs to get back to what he was doing a year and 2 years ago with throwing that curveball. So I don't know how to fix it. Charlie Morton knows what needs to be fixed. Everybody knows what needs to be fixed. It's one pitch that separates him from being the numbers we're seeing right now to a decent starting pitcher.
And even across his starts, like you saw some improvements with his command, even just in his most recent start, where the command yesterday was much better than it had been in previous starts. Just early on into the game against the Guardians, where he was locating the zone a lot better, and the command was just much better because that had been an issue, and he also, like you mentioned, would be the first person to tell you that in previous starts his command was not as good as it needs to have been. The 5th inning was where it started to go downhill yesterday, because if you had stuck in with how strong the beginning of his start was, then it would have been a whole different story. It's just everything needs to find a little bit more consistency. The curveball needs to get back to its best potential for him, which will then lead him to be back to its best potential.
And, he had the game against Boston where it was just 2 mistakes. He gives up 2 2-run homers to Alex Bregman and Christian Campbell, and it's just 2 bad pitches, and he strikes out 10 guys in that game. And the bad innings just kind of pile up on Morton. I mean, he got out of a jam yesterday, only allowing 1 run, and then things unraveled later in the game. But if he gets the curveball working, he's back to being fine. So I don't think it's an age thing for Charlie Morton. I don't think it's anything like that, because there's no issue in velocity. There's no issue in break. It's just one pitch. He's got to find that one pitch. And I think you can say a similar thing about Dean Kramer, who has an 8.16 ERA right now, where last year he adds in the splitter. It's a really good pitch for him. And this year, the splitter has not been good. I mean, he's kind of leaving it middle. It doesn't have the break that he really wants it to have. And again, Kramer and Morton were always going to be in this starting rotation, regardless of the depth. And so you need both these guys to step up. And it's kind of interesting that it's a similar story for the two of them, where the split finger, for Kramer last year was a good offering. He's not going to be a guy with a blow you away fastball, but it's going to be a good cutter sinker and a splitter to play off of it. And when Dean Kramer is at his best, that's what's working well. And his last start in Arizona, it was a pretty good sinker cutter day. I think he gave up a long double to Pavin Smith on the cutter, might have been a homer, but the splitter just wasn't working. It was in a bad spot, and it's not moving the way that he wants it to move right now.
Yeah, and with Kramer, the hard part, too, to wrap your head around with Kramer and Morton as well, is they're not eating a lot of innings, which is making it really, really difficult for the bullpen, especially when you have Kittredge out and a guy like Felix Bautista, who is also trying to come back to his full potential.
Bullpen, which has been really good, by the way.
Yeah, very good. Bautista also recording his first save since 2023. That was a big moment. But they're still getting the work, and that is an issue, to put it bluntly, with the starting rotation. I mean, you also even look at Dean Kramer. He hasn't put up a start more than 4 1/3 innings this season.
Yep.
When you look at last season, in just September and August, there were only 2 starts out of
a lot more.
Not good at mental math, but like 8, where it was fewer than 4 1/3 innings. So that is also another big thing that both Kramer, Morton, Sugano really need to get the innings counts up to be able to stay afloat.
Yeah, I mean, Cade Povich, too.
Yeah,
right? I mean, even Cade Povich and Tomoyuki Sugano. Povich has a 3.60 ERA. Sugano's at a 3.86, but Cade Povich is allowing a 3.69 batting average.
Yeah.
Sugano's at 3.04, and he's only got 5 strikeouts and 5 walks. His second start was really good. We've seen good flashes from Cade Povich, but they're not working deep into games because they're still getting into trouble. Yeah, they're working out of that trouble, and they are not having the same sort of results that Charlie Morton and Dean Kramer have had so far, and that's good, but they've got to start working deeper into games. And we're not breaking any news here. The rotation knows that they need to be better. They have the worst starting pitcher ERA in baseball. They're at over 5.5, and no other team in baseball has over 5. That's not sustainable. And there are plenty of arguments to be made about, you don't have your best 3 starting pitchers in Eflin, Grayson, and Bradish. You don't have 2 guys that you thought you would have to begin the season out of that group in Eflin and Grayson. But these 4 guys, we knew they were going to make starts throughout the season. And you can live with the 360 and the 386 from Povich and Sugano. It's not outstanding numbers. It's not great strikeout stuff. Again, the batting average against is not awesome, but you can't live with 2 ERAs over 8 with Morton and Kramer, and it is a small sample size. Again, it's just 4 starts for Morton, 3 starts for Kramer. And if Morton figures out the curveball and Kramer figures out the splitter, they're talented pitchers.
Yeah.
And they are perfectly capable of being a solid number 4, number 5 starter in this rotation. They just need to find it. But the sense of urgency has gone from, okay, we're fine, we're treading water until these other guys get back, to all of a sudden this team is 6-10. And the other part of this conversation as well, yes, those guys need to put up better numbers in the starting rotation, but in Morton's 4 starts, the Orioles have put up 12 runs.
Yeah.
2 of them came yesterday after Morton was out of the game. In Kramer's 3 starts, there's 11 runs. 9 of them came in his first outing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're not, I mean, Dean Kramer and Charlie Morton could give you 6 innings, 4 earned, and firmly keep you in the ballgame, but the offense hasn't been scoring for those guys either. So it's 2 sides of the coin where, those guys aren't pitching well, but the Orioles haven't been particularly close in the games that they have started. So there's problems in the offense as well.
Right, it's completely a two-way street, and you even heard from Dean Kramer when it was that first start where he was asked, how great is it to have such a strong offense behind you to keep up your good start? And he's like, oh, of course, it's like the best thing ever. Obviously, it was more eloquently put than that, than what I'm saying, but it's just a big thing to have a good start, a decent start, and also decent offensive performance to be able to fill the rest of the game and have a complete and holistic win. And right now, it's just not that. It's either decent pitching and a really good offensive performance or the other way around.
Yeah.
And it just needs to be a lot more consistent. And obviously, when you're down Colton Cowser on offense, that hurts a lot. And when you have guys who have been meant to be brought in as platoon bats, especially from the right side, that aren't necessarily mashing against lefties like they're meant to do, it is hard to be the offense that it was supposed to be coming into the season.
Yeah, so let's talk about the offense because, as you mentioned, this team right now either has great games or they have bad games. And in the games where they are bad, they look like a bad baseball team. And they're not a bad baseball team. On paper, this is a talented roster that should win a lot of baseball games. But in the games that they have lost, they're not putting anything together. And in the games that they have won, they are putting it all together. It seems like they are either winning 8-2 or they are losing 2-8. Those are kind of the two outcomes right now. I can think of 2 games this season where it feels like the Orioles have played a complete game. It was last Monday in Arizona when they scored 5 runs off Zach Gallen. The bats were a little quiet down the stretch of that game, but they did enough. And Zach Eflin was excellent, and the bullpen was excellent, and they win that game. And then Saturday against the Blue Jays, I mean, it was a huge turnaround game where, Adley Rutschman hits the huge home run, gets the team fired up. It feels like the mojo came back for them a little bit. Even Sunday's game where they lose in extra innings.
Right.
Yeah, Gregory Soto gives up a couple of runs. That's going to happen throughout the course of the season, but at least the offense was fighting and they were firmly in that game. I know you don't want to lose it in extras, obviously, but I'll take a loss like that over some of the losses that we have seen this season. The lineup has just flat out been inconsistent. The overall numbers look pretty good. And again, you can point to the fact that you don't have Colton Cowser. Like you mentioned, he could have been a 20-30 home run guy. Gunnar Henderson, he had a nice game yesterday. He's still finding his way back a little bit. He's hitting the ball really hard. Just needs to find a bit more of a rhythm. But the lineup has just flat out been inconsistent. And you have 6 guys who are pretty much always in the lineup right now. Gunnar, Adley, Westy, O'Neill, Mullins, and Mountcastle. Mountcastle's made 13 starts. I mean, Jackson Holliday is pretty consistently in there, too. He's made 13 starts this season as well. You have a lot of games of O'Hearn, Kerstad, and Holliday, and those seem to be the best 9. And there have been a lot of fan frustrations about platoons. So let's have the platoon conversation and what that could potentially mean for this lineup not really finding a rhythm. I think there are valid arguments to be made on both sides. I'll start with the pro-platoon argument. This is a thought, I had as well. John Mioli on the Banner Baseball Show articulated it well, so I kind of want to echo that point. You brought in guys like Ramon Laureano and Gary Sanchez to hit left-handed pitching. You knew they weren't going to start every single day. They didn't bring in Jorge Mateo, but Jorge Mateo falls under that umbrella because he has a similar role there. You brought in Laureano and Sanchez to hit lefties. I know Gary Sanchez doesn't have spectacular numbers against lefties in his career, but he is a powerful right-handed hitter. Ramon Laureano has pretty drastic reverse splits. He is a good hitter against left-handed starting pitchers in his career. If you aren't going to start those guys in mid-April against lefties when other guys need an off day, when are you going to start them at all?
Yeah.
And there is an argument to be made that maybe you just don't start them as much. And I think that is an argument that we are going to get into, but this is what you brought these guys in for. Ramon Laureano is a versatile defender in the outfield and should mash against left-handed pitching. That is what he has done throughout his career. His career splits back that argument up. How he has started the 2025 season, that is, of course, an argument on his own in terms of what kind of playing time a guy like that should have. Jorge Mateo is a similar case. His numbers against lefties aren't outstanding in his career, but they are significantly better than his numbers against right-handed starting pitching. And Mateo should be a good defender at second base and a good defender at shortstop. Those are the numbers that you are trying to back up those sorts of decisions with. And again, if you aren't going to play them in mid-April, are you going to play them at all?
Yeah, I mean, with Mateo, it's also interesting because you saw him improving at the plate and his offense improving last season very, very drastically compared to the season before. And that was a big focus of his plate approach. And it was improving. The numbers you could see were there right up until his injury. So you kind of look at it and be like, okay, this injury was a huge, huge roadblock for Jorge Mateo.
Sure.
Not only just playing time, of course, because he was out for a decent chunk of last season and maybe almost didn't even make it to play in April this year. So obviously that's a big roadblock. But when you look at the hindrance from him having that injury, the progress he was making offensively to now, it seems like a big roadblock. But then when you also mention and take a step back at those three guys, Gary Sanchez, Mateo, and Ramon Laureano just yesterday against Logan Allen, 0 for 6.
Yep.
And those are guys that you want to have in the lineup. Gary Sanchez is a little bit of a different story because obviously he's a backup catcher.
Gary Sanchez needs to play. Adley Rutschman can't
right.
catch every day.
You didn't bring Sanchez in to be specifically a lefty masher, but he's a backup catcher, and he also has offensive upside comparatively to other backup catchers to be able to do that. But 0 for 6 against Logan Allen is not what you want from them. I think you can also make the argument with Laureano, where slightly similar to last season in 2024, where the first half of the season was a 181 batting average, comparatively to the second half, a 304. So, yes, you could look at that and say, the second half, he's a second half player, it'll get better, and it's a new ball club and everything, and you just need to get him to be back to that top form. But how much time do you have when you're 6-10 right now to let that time marinate?
And that's why we're having the conversation right now, because this is a 6-10 team. And so every lineup decision is going to be scrutinized. If this team was 10-6 and you have Laureano and Mateo and Sanchez in the lineup at the same time, and those guys don't hit great and you lose that game, you go, okay.
Yeah.
Because those guys need to find a rhythm too, right? They need to play at some point, or else they are just never going to be in rhythm enough to give you any sort of contribution down the stretch. I will say Gary Sanchez had an RBI single yesterday. Jorge Mateo had a double. They did at least contribute a little bit to the offense yesterday. But there's an argument to be made for them, too, that they've got to play if they're going to find any sort of a rhythm down the stretch if you need them at some point. On the other side of that argument, Jackson Holliday and Heston Kjerstad have not gotten really any opportunities against left-handed pitching this year. Heston Kjerstad has been in occasionally. Jackson Holliday, I don't think has gotten a start against a lefty yet this season.
I think Sean Newcomb maybe.
But just because maybe one start against a lefty.
Brandon Hyde said that it was his best start against, or his best plate approach that he saw against a lefty in a while. But then there was some frustration with fans who were like, why didn't he start against Garrett Crochet? But it's Garrett Crochet.
It's Garrett Crochet. And there are two sides to that argument too, where on the one hand, if you are going to give Jackson Holliday and Heston Kjerstad a day off and you are going to find time for Ramon Laureano and Jorge Mateo, why not do it against a left-handed starting pitcher where Mateo and Laureano have better numbers, and Jackson Holliday and Heston Kjerstad, you have question marks about how they have hit lefties in their career. Heston Kjerstad, by the way, though, has a 318 batting average against lefties. That's good. Jackson Holliday is hitting just 125. But on the flip side of that, how is Jackson Holliday going to get better at hitting lefties in the major leagues if you don't let him hit lefties in the major leagues? So every conversation that we have about the offense at this point feels like there are minute details and arguments and counter arguments, and it is hard to specifically diagnose. I will say I do think Brandon Hyde deserves some credit for keeping Cedric Mullins in the lineup consistent. I know there's a Colton Cowser injury where you don't really have a true backup center fielder outside of Ramon Laureano. And I'm not giving Brandon Hyde a medal for keeping his best hitter in the lineup in Cedric Mullins. But if the Orioles were truly married to just, we are going to go off of every single platoon split for every single player every single time, then we would not see Cedric Mullins against lefties as frequently as we have recently. We would not see Ryan Mountcastle against righties as frequently as we have recently. There is absolutely an argument to be made that if you just believe that the 6 guys that are playing consistently, along with O'Hearn, Kjerstad, and Holliday, are just your 9 best baseball players, maybe you just, continue to veer away from the platoon mindset and just go with your 9 best baseball players and say, okay, go win me the baseball game. There's absolutely an argument to be made there. There's a lot of arguments to all of these things because the Orioles are not the only team that platoons. A lot of big market, high money teams platoon all the time. This is not a novel idea to the Orioles. It is just, we've got a microscope
People forget
here,
that.
right? This is not an Oriole-centric problem, but it is one that the Orioles are going to have to figure out because whatever the issue is, whatever you want to point to, whether it is injuries, whether it is somebody like Gunnar Henderson needing to be the catalyst for this team and not really getting going, not hitting enough home runs as a lineup in general, or the platoon splits, whatever is happening, they are just not finding a rhythm in the way that they need to. And combine that with the starting rotation that has not found it yet, and you're left with a 6-10 baseball team.
Right. There's just a whole boatload of unanswerables right now where
Yeah.
you really cannot pinpoint it to one direct thing. But you also take a look at some other guys like Tyler O'Neill, where yes, he is meant to be an everyday outfielder and fill that role a little bit more than Anthony Santander, and other guys fill that role as an everyday comparatively to Heston Kjerstad or Ramon Laureano in that sense. But he also was meant to bring in power from the right side of the plate and mash against lefties. But again, he's 2 for 15 against lefties this season. And you can also take a step back and look at how it is still a small sample size, both for starting pitching and offense. But the mojo has got to be found at some point, and it's got to stay consistent because we saw parts of this last season where, okay, all they needed was a walk-off or all they needed was one big moment to shift the narrative, but then the next day it was different. And the next day it was completely back to the other side of the story and the other side of being back to a slump. So it really just has to be consistent and also match the same energy of both sides of the street, where if you have a decent starting from a pitcher, you got to back it up with great offense.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole kind of mess right now with consistency and injuries and platoon conversations.
Yeah,
There's a lot.
But
going
I think
on.
that's a kind of a good point to end it on, which is that the vibes just need to be there. You need to feel it with this team. And right now you don't. I mean, I wrote an article Sunday morning after the win on Saturday where it was, you have the Adley Rutschman home run where Adley Rutschman doesn't bat flip, and he bat flips and looks into the clubhouse, looks into the dugout, and like guys are fired up. And then all of a sudden, 2 more guys get on base. Cedric Mullins hits a triple and gets up yelling, and it was like, okay, here are the Orioles.
They're back.
And then Sunday, I thought they played a good game overall. Like I said, I know the bullpen didn't come through the way that you would hope. That happens sometimes, even to good baseball teams. That just happens throughout the course of a season. But then yesterday, it's like, oh man, we're back. And where, you didn't see the body language, you didn't see the excitement, and it was a cold, windy day at Camden Yards. But man, I mean, the Orioles just didn't show a ton of life yesterday, and they need to, because we can have as many conversations as we want about, who's in the starting rotation and the platoon decisions and all of that stuff. But man, if they're not playing with the same energy that we're used to seeing from this team, I don't care who's out there. You need to have the energy. You need to have the juice. And, maybe it takes a series win to find it. Maybe it takes a walk-off, like you said. It felt like Saturday was that moment with the Adley home run and the Mullins triple, and it didn't carry over into this week.
Right, and don't get us wrong. Like you mentioned before, there is a ton of talent in this ball
There's
club.
too much talent to have a 6-10 record, which makes it frustrating. That's why every fan is frustrated. That's why this is a frustrating podcast to even have to have, because they are way too talented to be doing this.
Right, and you can also take a look at, yes, there are bright spots in this offense. Cedric Mullins, of course, being one of them. 3 for 9 with 3 RBIs against lefties. That is not something that he is meant to be able to do, and he is doing that. So, of course, like you mentioned, it is good that he is staying in the lineup. I mean, Gunnar obviously is still waiting to be a little bit more of a catalyst that we both know that he can be, but he is coming off of 2 multi-hit games in a row. Mountie has had 1 hit and 2 hits in the last 2 games, respectively. Westberg has not had a hit since Kansas City. You need him to be the guy that he should be and was last season, especially when it came to clutch situations.
Yeah, Jordan Westberg sitting that last game in Toronto and then also got an off day in Arizona, and Brandon Hyde noting that he had some upper body injury stuff going on.
Training too.
If I had to put my detective hat on and wonder why Jordan Westberg has not been performing well over the last few weeks.
Something going on.
Yeah. minor injuries that Jordan Westburg is fighting through at this point, and Jordan Westburg is a tough dude, and I'm not surprised that he is out there.
Right.
But if you were looking for a reason as to why Jordan Westburg is not hitting the way that we are accustomed to seeing Jordan Westburg hit, I think there's probably something going on.
And then you can also look at, obviously, Colton. And I feel like this is the last thing I can mention, that it just the dynamic is very different when you don't have Colton Cowser in the lineup because it splits up how good it is from 1 through 9.
It's 20, 30 bombs and elite defense.
Yeah.
It's a really good player to not have right now. But the Orioles are going to have to figure it out, quite frankly, because it is a 6-10 record to start the season. The season is not won in April, and there is nobody that is running away with the AL East right now. And the Orioles are, quite frankly, kind of fortunate that that is not happening. And they are still only 3.5 games from the division-leading Yankees, who are 10-7, which is not a good start to the season for them. Nor are the Red Sox, being 9-10, happy with their start to the season, or the Rays probably at 8-9. So the Orioles are not even the only team in the division that are probably not happy with how the first 16, 17, close to 20 games for the Red Sox somehow, I don't know how that happened, games to the season have started out, but they've got to figure it out because, it's mid-April, and you don't want to slam any panic buttons, but the sense of urgency, I think, needs to increase.
And you got to get some guys back.
Yep, you do.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, but I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of the Bird's Nest. Hopefully next week the vibes are going to be better. It's going to be a much more positive podcast. But
we're not doctors, so don't take our diagnosis for
we certainly are not, but
everything.
We tried our best here. Thank you for following along with us live here on YouTube and Facebook. We are live every week at 11 a.m. on those two platforms, or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find Andy and I here on The Bird's Nest. Big thank you to Amy Jennings behind the scenes for producing this one. For Annie Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.